The America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, the pro-right-wing lobbying group that purports to support Israel, is spending millions of dollars in primaries against progressives. Now, this is something that has been happening for some time. They've been inserting themselves in some of these hotly contested Democratic primaries and throwing around millions of dollars for the very pro-establishment candidates. So now, one of its many targets is actually kind of surprising. Although I guess when we get into the details, it won't be that surprising. But given that this group says that they are pro-Israel, they're going after Detroit Congressman and former trade union leader Andy Levin. So Andy Levin is related to Carl Levin, and whose father was Sandy Levin. So now, look, the Levin family is very, very pro-Israel. So this is very interesting. So now Andy Levin describes himself as a committed Zionist, and yet AIPAC is claiming, no. Andy Levin is not pro-Israel enough. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that Levin had also spoken out favorably for Palestinian human rights. Hey, why don't we give this group of people, human rights and actually treat them like human beings? And that turns out, if we do that, we'll actually help Israel too. No, too much. Now, let me give you a statement that he said last year. This was first his Twitter account, then I'm going to go to what was on his website, or is on his website. He said, I believe U.S. policy must support real human rights for Palestinians and real security for Israelis, who have a right to live without fear of deadly rocket fire. We must admit that the status quo protects neither and examine the policies that brought us here. All right, so look, to me, I look at that and I'm like, okay, nothing controversial. This man is actually in favor of a two-state solution, which, again, is supposed to be something that the Democratic Party supports. Now, in a statement, there's a little bit more here. He wrote this: let me state unequivocally that rocket fire from Hamas and Islamic Jihad is depraved and intolerable, and Israel has a right to protect Israelis. I will never forget seeing bomb shelters scattered throughout Israeli communities and learning that folks have as little to 8 seconds to reach them. Now, again, this is the person that AIPAC says, oh, you're not pro-Israel enough. Now, he says this: at the same time, we must recognize that Israel's retaliatory strikes should not be grossly disproportionate under universally recognized laws of war. As a Jew who rejects tribalism of all kinds and takes seriously the duty to love the stranger as myself, even and especially under the most difficult of circumstances, we must do everything we can to halt the killing of innocent civilians on both sides. He said, I understand and agree that stopping the ongoing violence is the Biden administration's immediate priority. To determine what must come next requires us to look at what brought us here. And this, of course, is where he gets into trouble with AIPAC. A deliberate campaign to dilute the Palestinian population of East Jerusalem, which is arguably exactly what is happening. Unarguably exactly what is happening. Now, he goes into the illegal settlements like in Sheikh Jarrah, saying that Israeli law is biased against Palestinians, and says that imposing that law is illegal in occupied territories, and that the forced removal of Palestinians from this particular area is not an accident. It is part of a systematic campaign with government support by settler groups to encircle the old city, root out the Palestinian population so that Jerusalem can be proclaimed Jewish, and ensure East Jerusalem cannot become the capital of a future Palestinian state. This is not presumptuous or hyperbolic. It is stated government policy. So Levin, that is a very, very, very bold statement coming from a member of Congress. I couldn't imagine 10 years ago that a Jewish member, a Democrat, would come out and say, yeah, this is some really effed up stuff. And it's not hyperbole. This is what's actually happening. They're displacing Palestinians to try to lay claim. Now, in that statement, he also correctly points out that I'm going to be labeled anti-Israel. Now, Levin, again, to point out, it's not just words. He had also introduced the Two-State Solution Act back in September of 2021, intended to promote a peace agreement, including by preventing the U.S. aid from being used to tighten Israel's grip on the occupied Palestinian territories and to block expansion of Jewish settlements and the demolition of Palestinian homes in the West Bank. That legislation also defined East Jerusalem as occupied territory, which the rest of the world also agrees with. But Israel says, no, 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 that entire city is ours. And by the way, when I mean Israel, when I say Israel, I mean the right-wing, so super conservative government of Israel. So let's be very fair about that. Now, as a result, Aipac has spent about $4 million to defeat Levin in northwestern Detroit in a new district. So we had redistricting. His district is now gone. The district that he's running in is now a little bit more conservative, but also contains about 40 to 70,000 Jewish voters. So now his opponent is Haley Stevens. Haley Stevens is a corporate Democrat who basically wants Israel to do whatever it wants to the Palestinian people. She doesn't care, as well as to reporters like Shireen Abu Akleh, who was killed by an IDF soldier. We know this. Eyewitnesses told CNN they believe that Israeli forces on the same street that Shireen Abu Akleh was on fired deliberately at the reporters in a targeted attack. All of the journalists were wearing protective blue vests that identified them as members of the news media, as well as helmets. It doesn't matter, though. They targeted and killed her anyway, and they did so for the crime of being a journalist, because she was covering the Israeli raids. Now, Aipac and the Democratic Majority for Israel is another supposed pro-Israel group, lobbyist group. They have poured millions of dollars into opposing candidates deemed to not be pro-Israel enough in this year's Democratic primaries. But they do something very interesting, right? And before I get to that, let's go to the money. Where's it coming from? Now, much of that money that goes into these PACs is not coming from Democrats. It's not coming from Democratic Jewish members or Jewish members of the Democratic Party. It's not coming from regular Americans that care a lot about Israel. No, 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 no. It's actually coming from Trump donors, right-wing Republicans, right-wing billionaires, including Jan Koum, the inventor of WhatsApp, who recently donated $2 million. Levin said that Aipac's involvement also raises the specter that the entire primary process is being hijacked by well-funded lobbies from big oil to the gun industry. That, of course, should not be surprising, because we've seen that happen in a lot of these Democratic primaries. Since you have this massive amount of corporate spending in our political system, you had the Supreme Court that had opened the floodgates with Citizens United and the other decisions that made corporations, people, and money speech. Yeah, you have all these groups now, and then you add in McCutcheon to it, there's no limit to the spending. There's no limit to the outside groups being able to spend all of this money to influence primaries. Now, look, Levin is a co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, Medicare for All. He supports labor rights, common sense gun reform, and has been endorsed by Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So, yeah, on issues, he appears to be fairly progressive. Now, that's another thing that Aipac and the Democratic Majority for Israel despise, again, because they're funded by right-wing billionaires, and they serve the establishment, and they actually elevate the most corporate establishment candidates. Now, he also says this, that the strategy to gather millions from right-wing billionaires and other Republican sources to try to determine the outcome of Democratic primaries is deeply troubling. I don't think the Democratic Party can really stand for it and maintain the integrity of our own elections, he told The Guardian at a campaign rally in Royal Oak. All right. He also adds, it's Israel today, but it could be the fossil fuel industry tomorrow. Well, I guess spoiler alert, it already is. It could be the tobacco industry, big pharma, any industry or any group that wants to have Democrats who are, and this is key, pliable and will do what they want. Well, that's exactly what they want. Aipac boasts that its favored candidates have won 9 out of their 10 Democratic primaries that they have been involved in the past few months. Now, one of the races, most famously, is where they interfered in Nina Turner's race to support Chantel Brown. Now, another one was when they tried to interfere in Summer Lee's race. But interestingly enough, getting to the tactics that Aipac has used, they actually don't mention Israel at all in their ads. Because look, that this foreign policy position, and that's what it is not something that most Americans or Democratic primary voters are concerned with. They're concerned about genuine kitchen table issues, raising wages, inflation, workers' rights, things like that. Good jobs. And so what Democratic Majority for Israel and Aipac had done was put out mailers. They flooded the airwaves. They used these mailers. They sent them out. And what they had done is it's lied about the progressive candidates to actually paint them as being more conservative than what they actually were. Now, let me show you one mailer here from Nina Turner's race. And so this is a mailer that was paid for by these groups. It falsely implied that she voted against a minimum wage, that she voted against universal health care and against immigration reform. Now, did she vote against the Democratic Party platform? Yes. And she said one reason why, or the reason why, is because it didn't involve Medicare for all. You know, actual universal health care. But that mailer, there's no context, there's no nuance on that. It just makes her seem like, she's against minimum wage, she's against universal health care, she's against any of that. You think that if she had gotten into Congress and they put any of that stuff in front of her, that she wouldn't say yes? Of course she would. But no. They're like, no, she's actually more conservative than the corporate Democrat that we put up in this race. I mean, it's really insane. But here's the thing. She was drowned out by right-wing money. Now, other critics note that while Aipac opposes Levin and other candidates deemed to be out of line with Israel, by accusing them of working against America's interests, it is actually endorsed. And this blows your mind, all right? It should blow your mind. 109 Republicans who voted against certifying Biden's victory after January 6th. So Aipac went against progressives, but then funded Republicans. They have endorsed Republicans. But it gets worse. It gets worse. The lobby has also poured millions of dollars into supporting Haley Stevens, who admits that she knows basically nothing about Israel. The only time that she had learned anything is when Aipac took her to Israel 3 years ago. Compare that to Levin, who again is Jewish and has strong ties to Israel. She had then also put emphasis on Israel's right to defend itself and has expressed skepticism about the U.S. rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. Now, hold on here. Now, one of you just pointed out in the chat that Obama is in ads for Stevens, right? But Stevens, she's like, the Iran deal. I'm kind of against that. I'm skeptical. Wait a minute. The Iran deal pushed by Obama. I mean, apparently it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter your policy positions. Or if you go against Obama, as long as you're a corporate Democrat that takes money from big corporations and wealthy donors and will actually do their bidding on domestic issues, well, then that's all we care about. Again, Levin comes from a line of politicians with strong ties to Israel, but yet still believes in Palestinian rights. Now, Levin accused Aipac of attempting to impose a single hardline view of what it is to be pro-Israel when he says he has a proud record of supporting the Jewish state and a two-state solution while advocating for Palestinian rights. He says his position has always been the position of every Democratic and Republican administration besides Donald Trump. Quote, they're the right-wing Israel lobby. They're not more pro-Israel than me. In fact, they're worse for Israel. If you want to be the best friend of Israel, you better give an honest opinion about what needs to happen for your best friend to be secure and safe and to thrive in the future instead of supporting whatever the Israeli government of the moment does right or wrong. This is the politics of intimidation. When I wrote the Two-State Solution Act, I can't tell you how many of my colleagues came up to me and said, "Oh, Andy, I read your bill. It's great. But of course, I'm not going to co-sponsor." And he said they didn't even need to say why. It's just assumed that they're afraid to cross AIPAC. Now, well, of course we know why. We know why, because they will take all this money, right-wing billionaire money, and they'll use it to put out ads. They'll flood the airwaves with just deceptive, lying ads about you. And they'll destroy your candidacy. And they'll call you an anti-Semite to boot. This money has an impact. And unfortunately, the impact is being felt in Michigan in this race. Opinion polls in February had the two candidates tied at 41%. At the time, Levin led among groups likely to be key to his victory, including union workers and women. However, the poll by the same company last week showed Stevens leading by a huge lead, 58-31. He's lost to women. In fact, the number of women who said they would vote for Levin had fallen sharply. And so Target Insights director, who's the people that did the poll, Edward Sarpolis, said UDP and other pro-Israel lobby money was a game changer because it had paid for advertising to pound away at Levin in support of Haley Stevens. AIPAC and the other pro-Israel groups kicking in the funds put her over the top because they're dominating the airwave with ads and mailings and that type of thing. Again, that's a pollster. Now AIPAC says, oh, well, their supporters say they're not doing anything other than, thing that any other group does, right? Look, those advocating for abortion rights or environmental policies, we're not doing anything that they're doing. But those critics also say that those groups are open about their intent, whereas most voters targeted by UDP and their funded ads have no idea that it's run by AIPAC or that its goal is to elect a member of Congress that they see as more sympathetic to Israel, even though, again, this is just more poor corporate. Fellow Democratic member of Congress Mark Pocan had also accused AIPAC and his allies of deceiving voters, which is true. It's not just dark special interest money that's spent on candidates. It's the sketchy, anonymous, misleading nature of the money that needs to get called out in the strongest of terms. He said, now we have groups in the Democratic primaries doing this in the most Trojan horse way. First, their values aren't stated as an organization. But second, they're raising money from Republican multimillionaires and billionaires to do this. It's stealth campaigning combined with dirty oppositional money to create a Trojan horse within a Trojan horse. I don't think that I could put it better than that. Right-wing billionaire money being used to take over Democratic primaries. Ironically, while the Democrats are also using their money to go and influence Republican primaries. But the end result here is progressives are destroyed. Always. And unfortunately, Democratic primary voters, you are being deceived by all of it. You're being lied to by these groups, these outside right-wing funded groups that are trying to get you to vote against your own best interests. And by the way, worse, if you are aware of this and you call it out, guess what? You're labeled to be anti-Israel, by extension, anti-Semitic, by a group that actually doesn't give a damn about a peaceful Israel. It really doesn't. Again, a lot of the right-wing billionaires, a lot of the far right, these extremists, they actually believe that building up Israel is just It's just something they need to do to bring back Jesus and kick off the end times. And I got to tell you, in the end times, Jewish people don't do very well when it comes to the Bible. And so, look, all that nonsense aside, supporting, Israel blindly as they actually commit human rights abuses is a terrible thing. And so when you have politicians in the United States that get voted on, that get voted into office as a result of this dirty money coming from these groups that will just uphold those policies, that should horrify everyone, especially since now Democratic voters are being far more sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinian people than they were traditionally before, especially younger people who are finally seeing the other side of the conflict and seeing that the Palestinian people deserve human rights. As far as our system goes, it's absolutely gross what's allowed in this system of legalized bribery and the billions of dollars, millions of dollars that are being used in ads funneled from outside groups.